If you were born before 1964, if you went through a divorce after 10 years of marriage, if you lost a spouse, there is a number sitting in your Social Security file right now that might be wrong, and nobody is going to call you about it. Here is the part that should bother you. 8,618 widows and widowers were underpaid. The total came to more than $50 million. Average loss, about $5,800 per person each. The Social Security Administration knows this happens. Their own watchdog wrote the report, and their fix so far, a reminder email to staff. So who checks your file? Nobody. That is the whole point of this video. This isn't a story about fraud, and it isn't a story about a government trying to take your money. It's something quieter, and in some ways harder to catch. A massive system processing millions of cases a year, running on decades of accumulated paperwork, where the default setting is silence. The system doesn't lie to you. It just doesn't go out of its way to tell you the truth either, unless you ask the right question, at the right time, in the right form. Grab a pen. In about 18 minutes, I am going to give you 3 numbers to look up in your own account tonight. And at the very end, I will show you the one step almost nobody takes, the step that actually gets the money moving. Let us start with why this happens in the first place. Your Social Security check is not calculated off your whole career. It is calculated off your highest 35 years of earnings. That is the formula. Simple, on paper. But the formula only works if the data feeding it is correct. And the data comes from decades of W-2 forms, employer reports, and IRS transmissions. Any single year that gets recorded wrong or recorded as zero, that mistake does not just affect one paycheck. It locks in, permanently, for the rest of your life. Now look at the scale. Between 2015 and 2022, the agency paid out close to $8.6 trillion in benefits. Out of that, $71.8 billion were what the Inspector General calls improper payments. That is 0.84%. 0.84% sounds small, until you remember what 1% of 8.6 trillion actually is. We are not talking about a rounding error. We are talking about real households. Here is a real one. A retiree opens their 2026 cost of living letter. Inside, Social Security lists their 2024 income as $556,128. The person never made anywhere close to that. No idea where the number came from. Turns out the IRS transmitted bad data and Social Security just inherited it. The retiree did nothing wrong. They just happened to be the one holding the wrong number. And it wasn't just an odd line on a statement. That phantom income figure feeds directly into Medicare premium calculations. A number that big can push someone into a higher income bracket for Part B and Part D, which means higher monthly premiums automatically, without anyone explaining why the bill went up. The person has to track down a wage and income transcript from the IRS, prove the number is wrong, and file a separate correction just to get their Medicare premium back to where it should be. One bad data transmission, 2 separate agencies, and a retiree stuck in the middle untangling both. This is the part that rarely gets said out loud. The error didn't originate at Social Security. It came from the IRS. Social Security just received it and treated it as fact. Nobody at either agency flagged it before the letter went out. The first human being to notice the mistake was the retiree, reading their own mail. And here is the part that should really catch your attention. One audit found close to 28,000 people underpaid because of a known gap in the system. The agency's own watchdog recommended a fix. Social Security agreed with the recommendation and then never implemented it. Think about that for a second. Not denied, not disputed, agreed, and still undone. There is an asymmetry here worth sitting with. When the agency overpays you, they move fast. You get a letter, a repayment plan, sometimes 50% of your monthly check withheld starting in 90 days. When they underpay you, there is no letter, no countdown, no urgency. The system reacts to money going out the wrong way much faster than it reacts to money never reaching you at all. That is not a conspiracy. Nobody designed it to be cruel, but the result is the same either way. Errors that cost the agency money get fixed fast. Errors that cost you money sit there until you find them yourself. So if a random data error can erase $500,000 of phantom income onto someone's file by accident, what happens when the error is not random? What happens when it follows the exact same pattern year after year for a specific group of people? That is next. Let us talk about widows and widowers specifically, because this is not a one-off story, it is a pattern. When a spouse dies, the surviving spouse is supposed to move up to whichever is higher, their own benefit or their late spouse's. That recalculation is called the widow's primary insurance amount. It is not simple arithmetic. It depends on the age at death, the filing history, sometimes years of records. And in thousands of cases, the agency got it wrong. The number again, because it deserves repeating. 8,618 widows and widowers underpaid. Over $50 million combined. About $5,800 per person, on average. Now here is the detail that turns this from a story into a pattern. The Inspector General found these errors clustered around two situations: spouses who died before age 62, and cases that required manual processing instead of automatic calculation. Read that again, manual processing. In other words, the more complicated your file, the more likely a human being touched it by hand, and the more likely something got entered wrong. That is not an accusation against any individual employee. It is a statement about volume. When millions of cases run through automated systems and a smaller batch gets pulled out for manual review, the manual batch carries more risk simply because it has more steps where a mistake can happen. And the Inspector General's estimate makes this even harder to ignore. Up to 40% of the surviving spouses they reviewed may have been affected by similar errors, not 8,000. Potentially a number many times larger, hiding in case files nobody has gone back to check. So picture the person on the other end of this. A widow, already managing grief, already managing a funeral, a will, a name change on a dozen accounts. She is not thinking about whether Social Security applied the right formula. She trusts the number on the letter. Why wouldn't she? The agency sent it. The agency is supposed to know. She has no way to compare her payment against what it should be, because she doesn't have a second number to check it against. There's no second letter that says, "Here's what you would have gotten under the correct calculation." There's just the one number, and an assumption that the people who sent it got it right. That assumption is doing a lot of work in this story, and it's an assumption that, for thousands of people, turned out to be false. That trust is exactly the gap this video is pointing at. And when the agency was confronted with the audit, what did they actually do? A spokesperson said they began, quote, "the process of implementing a reminder message to field office employees." A reminder. Not an automatic review of every survivor file in the system. Not a proactive search for every widow who might be owed money. A reminder. If you lost a spouse and you are receiving survivor benefits right now, that is worth pausing on. Was your case handled automatically, or was it flagged for manual review because something about your situation was unusual? You may not even know the answer. Which is exactly why it is worth asking. Now, if you are sitting there thinking, "I am not widowed, this does not apply to me," hold that thought. Because there is a second group carrying a version of this same blind spot. Except this time, the problem is not a system error. It is something almost nobody tells you about in the first place. Here is a number that might surprise you more than anything else in this video. A national survey asked adults a simple true or false question. If you are divorced, you may be eligible for Social Security benefits based on your ex-spouse's record. 50% got it wrong. Half the country does not know this benefit exists. And it is not some obscure loophole. If your marriage lasted 10 years or longer, and you are currently not remarried, and you are at least 62, you can claim a benefit based on your ex-spouse's earnings record. At 62, the minimum is 32.5% of their full benefit. That percentage climbs the longer you wait. Now here is where most people get stuck, and it is not a paperwork problem. It is a psychological one. People assume claiming this benefit somehow takes money away from their ex-spouse. It does not. Your ex-spouse's payment stays exactly the same whether you file or not. Social Security calculates your claim completely separately. Your ex doesn't even get notified. You do not need their permission. You do not need to speak to them at all. So the barrier is not the rule. The rule is generous. The barrier is that nobody explained the rule, and the silence got filled with an assumption that felt polite but was simply wrong. Picture a woman who was married for 16 years, divorced at 45, and never thought about Social Security again until her 62nd birthday. She files for her own retirement benefit based on her own work record, and that's the only number she ever sees. Nobody at any point in that process asks her about her marital history before 19 years ago. Nobody flags that her ex-spouse's earnings record might actually produce a higher payment than her own. The system pays her exactly what she applied for, and nothing more. It is not required to volunteer the better option. That responsibility sits entirely with her, and she never even knew there was a second number to check. 30% of people in that same survey did not even know spousal benefits exist at all, divorced or married. So this is not a small information gap, it is a structural one. There's also a detail that makes this worse for people who assume the rules are simple. The benefit is not automatic, and it is not retroactive forever. You have to actively file. If your ex-spouse hasn't claimed their own benefit yet, in some cases, you can still claim against their record once they reach retirement age, depending on when you were born and how the rules apply to your specific birth year. None of that gets explained in a pamphlet. It gets explained, if you're lucky, by a claims representative on the other end of a phone call you had to make yourself. Now put the two groups side by side for a second. Group 1, widows and widowers, where the system made a calculation error. Group 2, divorced spouses, where there was no error at all, just silence. Two completely different causes. Same result. Money that was legally available sitting unclaimed because nobody flagged it. If both of those gaps existed quietly for years, here is the real question. Has there ever been a moment where the government actually admitted a benefit category was broken at scale and tried to pay people back? Yes, and it just happened. The numbers from that fix will put everything else in this video into perspective. In January of 2025, a law called the Social Security Fairness Act repealed two provisions, the Windfall Elimination provision and the government pension offset. For decades, these two rules reduced or completely eliminated Social Security benefits for public workers who also received a pension from a job that didn't pay into Social Security. Teachers, firefighters, police officers. Over 3,200,000 retirees were affected. Some of these people had a spousal benefit that was reduced to literally $0 because of the offset, so they never even bothered applying. Why would you fill out paperwork for a check you were told would be nothing? Think about what that actually meant for someone's daily life. A retired teacher's spouse, working 30 years in a school district with a pension plan that never paid into Social Security. For decades, every retirement seminar, every benefits counselor, every conversation with a coworker carried the same message. The offset will wipe out anything you'd get from your spouse's Social Security, so don't waste your time applying. People built entire retirement budgets around that assumption. Some never told their financial planner to even check, because everyone around them had already accepted the rule as permanent. When the law repealed those provisions, the payments became retroactive to January of 2024, and the scale of the catch-up is staggering. In Louisiana alone, close to 73,000 people received a combined total of $566,209,833.81. That is one state. Sit with that number for a second, because it tells you something important. That is not an abstract policy statistic. That is real money that had been sitting just out of reach for years, attached to real names, real addresses, real people who had simply been told, no, this isn't for you. And here's the detail that connects directly back to everything we just covered. Before this law passed, an earlier audit had already flagged the exact same offset rules as a source of ongoing errors, costing the system roughly $46 million a year in incorrect payments that couldn't even be fixed retroactively because of a legal principle called administrative finality. In plain terms, once enough time passes, the agency can simply decline to correct its own mistake, even when everyone agrees it was a mistake. So this was never a hidden, isolated problem. It was a known, named, audited problem for years before anyone fixed it. Here's the part that should keep your attention, even if you already know about this law. More than a year after it passed, some retirees are still waiting for their full benefit to be corrected. Not because the law doesn't apply to them, because their case is more complex, and complex cases move slower through the system. And there's a specific group at risk of falling through entirely. People who, because of the old offset rule, never filed an application in the first place. The repeal doesn't automatically find you. If you never applied because you were told the benefit would be zero, the system has no record that you were ever owed anything. You have to go back and apply now, as if starting fresh. So the question is no longer just, does Social Security owe me money? The real question is, am I the kind of case the system finds automatically, or am I the kind of case that has to walk through the door myself? And that question has a deadline attached to it. Let's talk about the clock. For correcting an earnings record specifically, there's a general window, 3 years, 3 months, and 15 days from the end of the tax year in question. After that, the agency can decline to make the correction. But here's the exception that matters most, and it's the one piece of hope in an otherwise frustrating set of rules. If the error wasn't your fault, if your employer failed to report wages correctly, or Social Security's own records dropped something that was actually filed, that time limit doesn't apply the same way. The agency retains discretion to fix what it calls errors on the face of the record, no matter how old. So the system isn't entirely closed off. It's just that almost nobody knows which category their error falls into until they actually go look. Here's the 3-step process, and it's simpler than people expect. Step 1. Log into your online Social Security account and pull up your full earnings history. Step 2. Compare it line by line against your old W-2 forms or tax returns. Step 3. If you find a mismatch, file Form SSA 7008, the Request for Correction of Earnings record, and attach your proof. Small but real detail that trips people up. Social Security records gross wages, not take-home pay. If you try to correct your record using your net paycheck amount, the numbers won't match, and your claim gets rejected for the wrong reason entirely. Use the gross figure from your W-2. There's a second detail that quietly derails a lot of claims too. If your only proof is an old, faded scan of a W-2 and the employer identification number is unreadable, the claims representative reviewing your file may not be able to verify it, and the request stalls. It's not a rejection of your claim, it's a paperwork bottleneck. A clear, high-resolution copy avoids the whole problem. Grab that pen now, because here are your 3 numbers. 1. Pull up your earnings record for the last 3 years and compare it to your tax returns. 2. If you were ever married for 10 years and you're now divorced and not remarried, check your eligibility for a benefit on your ex-spouse's record, even if you've never applied. 3. If you or your spouse worked a government job with a pension and you were ever told your benefit was reduced or zero because of it, go check whether the Fairness Act repeal applies to your case and whether you've actually filed. And here's the step almost nobody takes, the one I promised you at the start. It's not the online portal, it's not the form. It's calling the actual phone number 1-800-772-1213 and asking a representative directly, was my case processed automatically, or was it flagged for manual review? That single question tells you whether you're in the higher risk category for an error, before you spend hours digging through paperwork that might not even be the problem. So where does that leave us? Social Security isn't out to get anyone. There's no evidence here of intent, no secret scheme to shortchange retirees. What the evidence actually shows is a system that responds when you speak up and stays quiet when you don't. Overpayments get caught fast because the agency has every incentive to catch them fast. Underpayments sit, sometimes for years, because nothing inside the system forces anyone to go looking. Silence from a government letter doesn't mean the number is correct. It just means nobody has checked. So here's a question worth sitting with. If an agency already knows its error rate, knows which groups are statistically more likely to be affected, and chooses not to run a full proactive review, is that an oversight, or is that simply how a system designed around budgets, not outreach, is always going to behave? Open your account tonight. Check your earnings record. Check your marital history against the rules we just walked through. And if you know someone older who this applies to, send them this video. Because like we said at the very beginning, nobody is going to call them about it.